presentation will be given by Xuefei Ren, the Associate Professor of Sociology and Global Urban Studies at the Michigan State University. Dr. Ren is a comparative urbanist whose work focuses on urban development, governance, architecture, and the built environment in global perspective. She's the author of 2 award-winning books, Building Globalization, Transnational Architecture Production in Urban China, published in 2011, and also Urban China, published in 2013. She is also the lead editor of Globalizing Cities Reader, coming out this year, 2017, from Routledge. Currently, Ren is working on a number of new projects, including a book comparing urban governance and citizen rights in China and India, and that's the book she's going to talk to us about today. She's also writing a photo documentary of Detroit and China's urban Rust Belt cities, and a series of comparative articles examining informal settlements, mega events, and spectacles in cities in Brazil, China, and India. 2016-2017, this year, she's the Frederick Burkhardt Residential Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies in Chicago. Dr. Ren received her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. Today, she's speaking, as you can see, on land, housing, and air, deciphering urban governance in China and India. Please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and I would like to thank the China Studies Center to invite me back. If I remember correctly, I was here 3 years ago in 2014, giving a talk about the same project. So I went back to China and India a couple of times over the past 3 years. And while working on this book, I also became interested in Brazil. So that took some time from working on this book. So hopefully I will have something more interesting to say compared to 3 years ago. I'm on sabbatical this year, so I'm trying to finish a first draft of the book. So I think this is a very good time for me to talk to real people, and instead of just writing by myself in the library, and get some feedback on what I've been writing about. So the topic of the project is urban governance. And I'm trying to compare how urban governance is different in the 2 countries with 3 sets of case studies on land grabs, housing redevelopment, and air pollution campaigns. And I have 6 sites. Not all of them are cities. 4 of them are cities, and then 2 rural, like small towns for land grabs. So today, this is the plan. So before going into the details about urban governance in China and India, I will just take a few minutes and talk a little bit about what is urban. So what does the urban category mean in the 2 countries? Just to unpack the concept we often take for granted a little bit. And then I will go I'll talk about urban governance, present my thesis of the book. And I don't have time to cover all 3 cases, so I think I will just talk about 2, land grabs and air pollution campaigns, or air pollution policy making in Beijing and Delhi. And then I conclude, and maybe we can have a discussion about how China studies can benefit from a comparative approach. What can comparison does, how we can maybe have some new perspectives or new insights by thinking China through elsewhere, other places. So let me start with the concept of urban. What is urban? So every country has probably a different definition for what is an urban area, or who should be counted as the urban population. So for China, there are at least 3 ways to define what is urban: by hukou, by land ownership, and by census. So the Census Bureau has its own definition for what is urban. So if you compare the official urbanization rates of China and India, this is the picture you get. For last year, 2016, 56% of the Chinese population lived in urban areas. And for India, the figure is much lower, 33%. So 56% is about 800 million, and 33% of India's population is about 400 million. So together, probably 1.2 billion people lived in urban areas in the two countries combined. But comparisons like this don't make much sense because the two countries have very different definitions for what is urban. Just very briefly, the Indian census definition for urban hasn't changed for almost half a century, since 1961. They've been using the same definition. So there are basically 2 criteria for defining urban places. The first is by administrative status. So basically all places with a municipality, basically a municipal government. So if a place has a municipal government or corporation, then it is urban. And the second criteria is more interesting. So for places which don't have a local municipal government, they can still be counted as urban if they meet some conditions on population size, population density, and non-agriculture employment. So in India, this second category is called census towns. It means they are urban only on census. They don't have any form of municipal government. And in 2011, that's the latest Indian census. So they counted about 3,864 census towns. And that's about 15% of the Indian population, so it's not trivial, the second category. It's very problematic. If you actually go to a census town in India, you will see the problems. These are very urbanized places, but they don't have any municipal local bodies to provide services. So you see garbage, on the streets, dogs, pigs roaming around. It's a huge problem because of the lacking of local authorities. So if you look at China from the 1950s to 2010, for each of the national censuses, the Census Bureau used a different definition for what is urban. So the urban population across different censuses actually is not comparable because the definitions have changed quite a bit. The first criteria is administrative status. So for places with some form of residential committees and street offices, they are urban according to the census. And then there's also a second criteria, which is something I don't quite understand. I think I should talk to some people from the Census Bureau. So for places that are connected by public infrastructure to the above urban areas, so places with the residential committees and street offices, they can also be counted as urban. So here the notion of public infrastructure is so vague. It includes roads, bridges, offices, residential buildings. So if you have, let's say, a rural village in the middle of a cornfield, and somehow that village is connected by a road to a nearby town, then the census would count that village also as urban. And I believe there's a huge inflation in the Chinese urbanization rates. because of the adjustment in the definition. But the bottom line for the Chinese definition of urban is, if the central government decides a place is urban, then it's urban. It has very little to do with the population size, density, or non-rural agriculture, non-agriculture employment. And every year, a lot of hundreds of rural localities are reclassified as urban because compared to rural governments, municipalities have much power and resources at their disposal. So there's huge incentive to be classified as urban. So if you compare the two countries, if you use a different definition for urban, for example, these two maps, they are based on small settlements with the 50,000 people. So it means basically small towns. Then you get a very different picture from the census. So India probably is more urbanized than China. And the urbanization pattern is also quite different. In India, it's much more balanced. There are small urbanized places basically all over the country. But for China, it's only on the east coast, east half of the country. So to summarize, so what is urban? I think first we should conceptualize the urban not according to a settlement types. In other words, urban doesn't mean cities, and rural doesn't mean villages. So it's probably more constructive to think of the urban as a process instead of as places, as cities, suburbs, towns, or townships. And second, in both countries, the urban is a state. You can use the Foucauldian term, technology of governing. It's basically a state classification scheme to control the population, but also to manage the territory. And in the two countries, the urban is quite differently politicized. As I mentioned earlier, in China, there's a very high incentive for places to be counted as urban because city governments have a lot of power. But in India, it's almost the contrary. A lot of rural places don't want to be classified as urban because the Ministry of Rural Development in India has a lot of subsidies and programs for rural places. So once a place has like a municipal corporation, it will be no longer eligible for these rural subsidies, tax waivers, and other types of infrastructure funds. So it's almost the contrary for India. So let me now just move to the main topic of the book. So the big question I'm trying to address is, so how different, how cities in India and China are governed differently. And there are two popular views explaining the difference. The first one is the state capacity approach. It's a very simple argument. So some people would argue that the local government in China is strong, and then the local government in India, by local I mean municipal level. So municipal governments in India are weak. So that's the main difference of the two countries. It makes sense. It's true. I don't disagree. But the problem is it doesn't explain why the local state in China is strong and then the local state in India is weak. And then there are also other scholars who focus on the regime types. So they would argue that Chinese cities and Indian cities work differently because India is democracy and China is not. And again, it's a very important point, and a lot of the variations can be explained by regime types. But to answer the question why the local state in China is strong and then the local state in India is weak, regime types don't work. Because if you look at other democracies, there are many other cases, like the United States, Brazil, where you find very strong local municipal institutions. So democracy doesn't mean weak local government. And on the other side, single-party rule, authoritarianism, doesn't translate into strong local governments. And China in the 70s, between the 50s and 70s, is a perfect example. In the socialist years, city governments, local governments in China didn't have much power because the country was very centralized. Most urban policy decisions during the socialist years were made at the national level, not at the local level. So let me just test my thesis with you. So this is the main finding of the book. So for urban governance in China, I find that it's more characterized by territorial forms of politics. In other words, China has a set of very strong territorial institutions, and these institutions powerfully shape urban policy making and also development outcomes. So one example of the the Chinese territorial institutions is the hukou system, and another example is land ownership, divided between rural and urban. And I call it territorial institutions because what these institutions do, they basically distribute benefits, rights very unevenly across localities. So there's a link between social security benefits and localities. Both hukou and the land ownership system in China does that. But in India, you don't find similar territorial institutions, but rather to get things done, to push policies or projects forward in India, it's often the case that you need to build an alliance, and it's so contingent. So just based on my fieldwork, I find that sometimes even with the same actors, under the same conditions, it might work at one time and it doesn't work at a different time. So contingent alliance building is quite central for understanding how urban policies are made and how urban development unfolds. So that's the larger thesis of the book, the difference between territorial and associational forms of governance. So let me just introduce two, from my fieldwork, two case studies to illustrate the divide between territorial and associational forms of governance. The first case is land grabs, land acquisition, land protests in Wukan. I assume most of you know where Wukan is. It's not a city, it's a small village, about 3 hours by bus from Guangzhou in the south, in Guangdong province. And in 2011, there was a major land protest. And there, last year, there was a few new developments happening, and I can tell you the story later. And the comparative case in India is Singer. It's again, it's not a city. It's a village about 1 hour by car outside Kolkata in the state of West Bengal. And in 2006, a similar land-based dispute broke out and it's probably one of the highest profile land protests in the country, with a lot of twists and turns. So, so let me just talk a little bit more about the land grab case. So unlike China, India does have private land ownership. Farmers, own land individually. But if you look at the statistics in both countries, there has been massive land loss on the part of the rural population. So both the state but also the private sector has been taking land from farmers for all kinds of things, build factories, build residential buildings. So just to situate land acquisition in the history a little bit, basically, if you look at the 20th century, the relationship between the state and the peasantry in China, but also in India, hasn't been straightforward. So in some periods of the 20th century, the state did land reforms and gave land back to the peasants. But in other periods, the state took land back from peasants and used it for different industrialization and also infrastructure projects. And this is the cover of a book I found in the library at the University of Chicago while writing this chapter on land acquisition. It's called Rural Survey, and it's written by Mao Zedong. So Mao was actually a great ethnographer. So he, in the 1920s and 30s, Mao spent quite a few years in probably Hubei, doing interviews with the farmers, but also landlords. And then, based on his field work, he wrote a few books on the land situation in China in that period. So just to go back to the 1920s, there were, in the 1920s and 1930s, there were already piecemeal land reforms happening in China. So one of the findings from this book by Mao is the land distribution in Chinese villages was highly unequal. So, for example, a statistic I remembered from the book is like 6% of the village population owned like 80% of the land, and so it's basically landlords and big farmers owned most of the land, and the majority of the villagers had nothing. So the conclusion is we need a revolution. So land reforms started taking place in 1920s and 1930s, and by the 50s, China basically got rid of private land ownership. But from the 50s to the 70s, the state took land back. That's the period of the Cultural Revolution, the rural collectivization. So land was concentrated in the communes, and the peasants lost land again to the state. So after 80s, it's the household responsibility system. So the state, the government realized the problem. There's no incentive for farming. So the state started to give land back to the peasants. And 1988, this is a big year. The constitution was changed by, so there's a new innovation. So land ownership remained public, but land use rights became a commodity. So there's this separation between land use rights and land ownership, and land use rights can be transacted at the market. So basically it's privatized. And from the early 1990s, so that's the beginning decade of China's high-speed urbanization, and that basically the whole model of the Chinese model of city making is land-based financing. If you look at the municipal revenue statistics, between 30 and 70% of the municipal revenues across the country come from land leasing. So that shows the magnitude, just how much city governments are dependent on land leasing. So that's like a brief trajectory of what happened in the land sector in the Chinese case. If you look at India, very similar. There's a lot of twists and turns over the 20th century. So India also had land reforms after independence, basically from 50s to 70s. But compared to China, land reform, because India never had a real revolution, a communist regime, so land reform in India was not that complete. Also, it varied quite a bit from state to state. Among all the states in India, there are only two states, West Bengal and Kerala in the south. So these two states had relatively aggressive or progressive land reforms, which means most land was distributed among the farmers, small or middle farmers from big farmers from landlords. So there has been there has been land reform in India as well, but it's not as complete as in China. And after the 1990s, the country began to urbanize at a faster pace. And then what happened after the 1990s was the state, all levels of the government, but also the private sector, have been very frequently invoking a very old, ancient colonial Land Acquisition Act from 1894 to take land from peasants in the name of public interests. And similar to China, so what counts as public interest is never clearly defined. Basically, all public projects, but also all private projects can qualify as public interests. And finally, in 2014, so this Land Acquisition Act from 1894 was abolished just because it's too contentious. The terms are terrible, so there's basically very little compensation offered to the landowners. So since 2014, there has been a new Land Acquisition Act. And if you look at the terms, it's much better. So for rural land, the new Land Acquisition Act requires double of the market price, and for urban land, 4 times of the market price as compensation given to the owners. So that's the recent development. And also 80% of the landowners need to give their consent for any land acquisition project to take place. So sorry for the details. I just want to give you some historical background. So to summarize, if you compare the history of land acquisition in China and India, between the 50s and 70s, both countries were doing actively land reforms. But as I said, in India, the reform was very partial. In most states outside West Bengal and Kerala, basically large landowners kept their land by different means. There was very little redistribution. And after the early 1990s, in both countries, there has been massive land grabs. And probably China, land acquisition in China has been more aggressive than in India. And here I just listed some examples of the factors why this has been the case. So the first thing is China doesn't have private land ownership. Private land ownership doesn't solve, problem of land grabs, but it is a buffer. If land is privately owned, then for any developer or state agency to acquire land, they have to negotiate with each family, each household. So that takes time. But in China, you don't have that. So you negotiate with one person, the village head, and then you get the village land. Also, in the Chinese case, there's a huge imbalance between municipal governments and the village governments. So if a city wants to merge some villages in the surrounding areas, in most situations it can do it because village governments are not real governments. The lowest level of the official government bureaucracy in China ends at the township level. So village governments are almost like voluntary self-governing associations. It can't be compared with the municipal authorities. Also, there's this change in the constitution which separated land use rights from land ownership. So that's a very big factor. And then there's rising demand for, from the manufacturing for building factories. And then the political system, again, has significant consequences. The court system doesn't work really independently in the Chinese case. So there are fewer checks and balances for land disputes. So let me just briefly go over the cases. This is the Singer case in West Bengal. It happened in 2006. The place is outside Kolkata. It's very well connected by train or by expressway to the city. So it's a very desirable location. And in that year, the state government of West Bengal just decided to take like 1,000 acres of land from farmers to build a factory for Tata Motors. Tata is a big Indian company to make cars. And then peasants, some landowners agreed to give their land and take the compensation. But not everybody agreed. So those who didn't agree, they started protesting. So quickly, the protest was almost hijacked by a political party. It's called TCP, the Trinamool Congress party. So at that time, the ruling party is in West Bengal is called the Communist Party of India Marxist, so CPIM. And the state was governed by a communist party for almost 30 years. And the peasants felt alienated by the Communist Party. So they went to the opposition party. So this lady, Mamata Banerjee, she's the leader of the Trinamool Congress party. So she basically used the Singer protest as a campaign platform to run the next election, and she won in 2011. And today she's still the governor, the chief minister of West Bengal. And then there's some new development just from a few months ago. So the land was, what happened was, so the factory didn't work out. The factory moved to Gujarat, another state. But the land parcel was frozen for like maybe 7 years, 6, 7 years. It was not returned to. It didn't belong to the factory, but it's not returned to the farmers either. And the case went up to the Indian Supreme Court. And a few months ago, maybe in late 2016, the Supreme Court ordered to return land back to the farmers. So that's a full circle. the farmers won after almost a decade of protest and struggle. So Wukan is probably more familiar with most of you. So it's in 2011, the village council tried to lease out land, basically the last parcel of the village land to some developer from Hong Kong. And then villagers started protesting. One of the activists died in the police custody, and then the protest became more violent. So if you look at how the villagers mobilized, the mobilization was clearly centered on territorial claims, which is the collective land ownership. I think the collective land ownership is a very ambiguous notion. So nobody owns land individually, but somehow the village as a whole owns the land. And in China, it really cuts both ways. It depends on how resourceful you are. In some villages, like in Wukan, it's basically unified thousands of people together it drove people to the streets. But in other cases, collective land ownership is not that good. It basically means power is concentrated in one person, the village chief. So if you can convince that person, then you can get the land. So just to come back to Wukan, the protest clearly targeted the local village council. So I think this is consistent with the scholarship in political science, which argues that for like rural protesters, not only in the land case, in a variety of situations, they somehow take advantage of the different priorities between different levels of the government. So the central and provincial governments have different concerns from the local governments, which are more worried about GDP. So, for the Wukan protesters, they said clearly, we want a new village government. The village officials are corrupted, but we support the provincial government and the Communist Party. And they were really very resourceful in reaching out to the media. They smuggled journalists from other countries, from Hong Kong to the village. So overnight, Wukan became a global news. This is a picture from the New York Times, probably from 2011. And then, so I actually went to the village in 2014, and just I read, there's a lot written about Wukan already, but I wanted to get a sense of the place, so I went to the village. And the people at the village were very open, super friendly. So I went to Lin Zuluan, so he's the new village chief. Went to his house, and he didn't know me. I introduced myself, and he invited me for lunch, for tea. So I stayed for 4 hours, almost the whole day. So he became the new village chief after the protest, and then last year he was arrested for corruption charges. And I don't know what happened. I can only speculate. I think after the new village government was elected, there has been a lot of pressure from the villagers for getting the village land back. The protest ended in 2012, so the land deal was blocked, but the villagers wanted all their land back. So for the last 20 years, the village has been losing land to different development projects. So there's a lot of pressure on the new village government. And under the Xi Jinping administration, probably there's less tolerance toward this kind of activism. So there has been a few new arrests of senior village leaders in the last few months. And then just to summarize, if you compare Wukan and Singer, the two cases, the local government, the subnational government, was differently involved. So for the Chinese case, it's the very local level, basically village government, that took land, tried to sell land, lease land to outside developers. And for the Indian case, it's the state government, so the equivalent of provincial governments in China. So, so for the Wukan case, the protest targeted the local government. And then the mobilization was very cellular. It means it's very much confined in the village. There were activists, journalists arriving from different parts of the world trying to help, but the villagers didn't want to mobilize outside their village. And the claim, the central claim, is based on territorial demands. So basically, they want their land back. They're not. So one villager told me that, you know, we are not democracy fighters. We just want our land back. And for the Singer case, we see instances of associational forms of mobilization, and specifically the strong intervention of political parties. It basically became a campaign platform for the opposition party to win elections. So that's an example of the contrast between land protests based on territorial claims and land protests based on associational forms of mobilization. And then let me just very briefly, so air pollution. There has been a lot of interest on the topic. Maybe last year, I think I came here to attend a talk by a Peking University professor on air pollution. So basically, in both China and India, there has been a lot of pressure over over air quality. But if you look at how urban policies are made in the field on air pollution, again, the difference between territorial and associational forms of governance stands out. So if you look at Beijing's war on air pollution, it's mostly led by the municipal government. There are NGOs, environmental NGOs. They are I'm not diminishing the role of Chinese environmental NGOs. I think they are very important in disseminating the information, try to improve the public access to the data, and they've made quite some progress. But if you look at the main action, it's very much led by the government. So the typical pattern is the central government would set a target. For example, by 2017, this year, the PM 2.5 level should be cut by 30%. And then that target is disaggregated among different territorial authorities, provincial governments, and then municipal governments, and then district governments, but also state-owned enterprises. And each government or each of these territorial authorities somehow has to sign a contract. It's called responsibility contract, 责任书, with the upper level government. And then they need to meet their target for their own jurisdiction. So that's what I mean by territorial authorities. So it really So that's the pattern. You have a main target, and then it's disaggregated among different local bodies with this responsibility contract system. And for the Indian case, if you look at what Delhi has been doing, it's almost the opposite. At the center, you have environmental NGOs, and they are really very powerful. By powerful, I mean they have a lot of resources, and they are the main actor driving all the action. The Delhi government hasn't been doing anything. So in the past 2 decades, it's these environmental NGOs which somehow tried to build alliances with the Indian Supreme Court, the different government regulatory agencies, industries, also the government itself, and then they somehow try to force the government to do something. And the biggest success happened in 2002. There's one environmental NGO in Delhi, so they basically pressed the Supreme Court to order the Delhi government to change the fuel for public vehicles to clean natural gas. So that's considered a major victory in the air pollution field. So it depends on very contingent alliance building between the NGOs and all other actors. So that's my example of associational forms of governance. And just to summarize, I didn't talk much about theory, specifically urban theory. So I'm in the field of urban studies, global urban studies. And the main problem is there has been a huge theoretical deficit in the scholarship, especially on cities in the global south. So the dominant theoretical frameworks are neoliberalism, post-colonialism. But if you work on Chinese or Indian, Brazilian cities, it's very clear that most cities in the global south don't fit neatly in these grand theories, neoliberalism or post-colonialism. So what I've been trying to do with this book, but also a few other of my ongoing projects, is basically to try to strike a balance between grand theories and very empirical research only focusing on local particularities. And I find a historical and comparative perspective is very helpful. It can really, at least for me, it can really shed light on the local, very different local developmental trajectories in each national context. And in general, I think for urban China studies at least, definitely it is time to move beyond like studies only focusing on Chinese cities. And it's just so helpful and so constructive to think about China through other places, India, Brazil, Africa. Before I started writing about India, I only wrote about Chinese cities, and after a while I just felt saturated. But now, after going to India, Brazil, it just gave me a lot of new ideas, insights about what's going on in China. So I wonder, I think a lot of you maybe work on politics, political science, and maybe we can have a discussion on how a comparative perspective can be beneficial for your area of study. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
And also, please use the mic when you're addressing your question so you can have a better recording of the Q&A section. Thank you.
Just to pick up on that last thing that you were talking about, how, like thinking with comparative cases. So one of the things that I'm a graduate student in political science. And one of the things that we were thinking about when thinking through comparative research is like what makes a good case comparison. So like one of the things we talked about are homogeneity conditions, right? Like the idea that you have to have similar enough cases across several dimensions to actually gain analytical leverage. Can you help think through what makes comparative case research, like, and how to think about where to go for cases that generate leverage on your theory?
That's a very good question. So I think not only in political science, but also in the field of historical sociology. So a lot of scholars have, maybe 20 years ago, so there was a strong preference for comparing similar cases. But now I think it's more open. And my view is that comparisons don't have to be limited to a similar or cases with the similar initial conditions only. I think if you do go that route, it's basically mimicking regressions. So you want to control independent variables, but we are not doing regressions. We only have two, maybe a few comparative cases. So you can't really compete with the large and study. So there's no need to be apologetic for your small sample size. It's tricky to choose cases. For my project, for any of the three topics, land, housing, air pollution, there are many candidates. And for me, the guiding principle, it's not scientific. So I just tend to choose the most complex cases, because the more complex the case is, the more actors are involved. Then that can allow you to maybe examine the interactions between different stakeholders. So if you're interested in comparative methodology, I highly recommend a South African geographer called Jennifer Robinson. So she has been writing about how to do comparisons, and it's Jennifer Robinson. And I find her approach just much more helpful than mainstream political science or historical sociology. Thank you for the question.
I have one kind of comment and then a question. So one thing that I've noticed in talking to migrant workers about their sort of ideas about urbanization, something I've been doing recently in inland cities, is that they really don't pay that much attention to hukou anymore, but they do pay a lot of attention to land ownership or apartment ownership. So I think it goes along with your story about how hukou is obviously one of the things that you're talking about too, about territory, but what I was really struck, because hukou has become less important in gaining access to public goods in cities, is that what they really focus on is whether or not they can buy an apartment in the city, and whether or not they actually get hukou is less important, because owning land or owning an apartment is the way that they get access to citizenship in those cities. So I was really interested in what you were talking about this territorial idea, because I think it's reflected by the obsession in China right now among both rich and poor people for ownership of real estate. The question I had was about the way that you set up the comparison at the beginning was about these other two explanations. One is state capacity, the other is regime type. And it seems to me that the regime type thing is still a really critical part of your story. In a sense, you're sort of filling in the story. But it seems to me the reason why you see this different type of mobilization in China versus India, and you see it also in the labor realm, not just in land disputes, is that people can't organize, right? There's no associational option. So my question would be, so if China was not a single party regime, wouldn't people organize and have associations and NGOs?
Yes. So first point on hukou, I agree with you. It's probably less important compared to the past in terms of helping migrant workers getting access. Also, there has been gradual reform in the hukou sector. So the situation has changed quite a bit. And for the second point, yes, so regime types, matter a lot. I think that's the context. So my just differentiation between territorial and associational forms of governance is really, I think I'm really trying to be more specific rather than just saying, okay, China is democratic and India is not. So, but the regime types, that's the, it lays out the basic institutional infrastructure, and that shapes forms of mobilization, governance, how important NGOs are. Yeah, so it's not either or. Yes. Yes.
In both cases, how do the villagers In both cases, how do the villagers make decisions among themselves? How do they decide that they are going to follow a particular route for fighting?
How do villagers?
Do they vote? Do they just follow a leader? What do they do?
It's. I think it's hard to generalize. I just returned from India like 2 weeks ago, and I went to a lot of urban villages. There are urban villages in India as well. For the Indian case, it's so the villages are structured according to the caste system. So one village can have like 30 different castes. So I think caste is the main channel of mobilizing. So one caste is a leader. So for the members of that caste, they just listen to the leader. So most people don't know what they should do. So they listen what the leaders decide to do. That's a big difference from Chinese villages. And even for China, as most of you know, villages in the north are different from villages in the south. In the south, a lot of villages are really old. So Wukan has at least 400 years of history. So it dates back to Qing dynasty, and Wukan has like 73 clans. Clans means like families sharing the same family name. So, in the Wukan case, the mobilization was really very easy because it's organized according to the clan system. When the village council new village council was elected, it happened in days. So 73 clans each recommended 2 people. So then you have like 140 people. And from these 140 people, 13 members were selected to form the village council. So that's why, it...
Selected how? How did they get from the 140 to the 13?
Oh, I think it's not, I don't think it's that democratic. So each clan just decided who are the top two candidates. And I think there are some documentation on the process, but it's not scientific. It's not open, election.
Thank you very much for that very clear comparison of the structural differences between urban areas in China and India. You haven't really said much about the economics associated with the transfer of land. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering a little bit whether it doesn't come into play. For example, your characterization of the success of the farmers in winning back in Calcutta their farming land. Do the farmers actually go back to farming, or do they really want to capitalize on the higher value associated with using their land as urban land?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're right. I didn't talk about the economic situations in the villages, and it's a very important factor. So for the Indian case, it's subsistence farming. So most protesters were marginal farmers or tenants, so people who cultivate land, but they don't own land. So for them to lose land, it's really it means losing livelihood. And for the Wukan case, the village is not dependent on agriculture at all. It's most young people have left, so they send money back to their families, and then their families can build, big houses. So it's not that much dependent on farming, but still they want their land back because land has different values. There's economic value, it's a commodity, but also sentimental value. The village has been there for hundreds of years. And also, I think for the Chinese case, land is also social insurance. So the young people, they can go to other cities, but if things don't go well, in the cities, they want to have a place to return, to have something to fall back on. So I think the economic situation in the two cases makes a big difference. It gives different reasons for people to protest. So you're right.
So thank you very much. This was a great talk. It was very interesting.
Okay, thank you for coming.